So moving on, we'd like to welcome Justin Longo to speak on harnessing Gen AI, a novel process for teaching and learning policy analysis. Dr. Longo will be joining us online, so while we get that queued up, just share a bit of a brief bio. He is an associate professor in the Johnson Trayama Graduate School of Public Policy at the U of R, where he directs the Digital Governance Lab. He has a PhD in public policy and public administration from the University of Victoria, and undertook postdoctoral work in open governance at Arizona State University and the Gov Lab at NYU, joining the U of R as the Cisco Research Chair in Digital Governance. His current research focuses on the social, organizational, and political implications of advancing technology. So we'll turn it over to you, Dr. Longo.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I trust you can hear me okay. Very thankful for this opportunity to speak with you this morning, and my apologies that I can't be there in person. I want to congratulate the organizers for putting together what, to me, in the last few minutes have been a very interesting set of presentations from Dr. Steele and Dr. Yao, who are talking about something very similar to what I want to talk to you about this morning, and coming at it from different angles, but we're dealing with an issue of what is it we're trying to do in our programs and what value I think we can offer to our students, and continue to make the argument that we are offering value, or recalibrating to make sure that we are. So the few things I want to talk to you about is what we're trying to accomplish in our program in the Graduate School of Public Policy, in which our primary degree is a Master's in Public Administration. One of the central artifacts of that teaching activity is centered on a document called briefing notes. These are short documents meant for decision support, and how that's changing with the introduction of generative AI, or at least in the way that I'm teaching how to write briefing notes. I'll talk briefly about the learning activity that my students go through in a typical 13-week course, and then some of the research questions that I'm exploring as to what actually the impact is on student learning, and what it means for how we teach in our program in the future, and generally what we're teaching and how we teach in universities. So first of all, with respect to policy analysis and briefing notes, again, our students, Masters in Public Administration students, typically go to work in government. They come to us because they want to work in the public sector, and then they go to work in government after they graduate. And one of the central activities, though by no means the central activity, the only activity, but one of the central activities that students, or should I say public servants, engage in the public sector is policy analysis and writing briefing notes. Policy analysis is simply providing decision support for decision makers who have to make a decision about what direction, what initiative, what policy, what program the government wants to undertake. What is the rationale for doing so? What might be the implications of doing that? And how might they go about implementing that? The policy analysis tries to take a rational approach to say what's been done elsewhere, what's the experience that we've had within that government or other governments, and how can we best structure and come at the problem that we're trying to solve. The policy briefing note is an artifact of that. It's simply the encapsulation of all of that analysis into a very short document. Typically, these are 2-page documents that summarize for a decision maker what the problem is, what the experience elsewhere tells us about that, what our analysis about the current situation says, and what options we might consider for moving forward, centering on a recommended option. This has application in other fields. In health, there might be something called an SBAR, a situation background assessment recommendation. Other acronyms, SWOT analysis, you're probably familiar with. The use in government centers on writing for senior decision makers, usually a minister or a deputy minister or other senior executive. The problem is usually assigned to the analyst. What is the problem that we're trying to solve, and then come up with recommendations. There's iteration on previous briefing notes, and usually these are an updating of an ongoing issue. And the briefing note can be different types, for decision, for response, for direction. There is a structure to these briefing notes, different in every organization, but they typically have a heading, a title, and an issue, current status and background, an analysis of the issue with options and recommendations, centering on a single recommendation, and key messages and next steps. This is an example of what a typical briefing note might look like. I've described to you all those different sections under options. Typically 3 options, the first of which is do nothing or status quo. Each of the options has advantages and disadvantages, sometimes called pros and cons. and some cost implications. As I say, a recommended option in most typical briefing notes, the recommended option, the punchline is put up at the front, so the decision maker knows where the briefing note is headed. But it can be, depending on the organization, the structure will look slightly different, but this is generally what a briefing note looks like. The traditional approach to teaching briefing note writing is to say, well, here's the template. This is the standard way. And you can check out, if you were to grab the slides from this, you can check out all these links. There are templates, many, many templates. But we take a template and we start filling it in by looking at background material, reading it, synthesizing it, and writing it perhaps in bullet point form or some other way that gives the reader a quick sense of what is the current status, what's the background, where's the analysis and recommendations coming from. This note here about number 2, a briefing note is the artifact of policy analysis. One of the challenges that is going on in the, if I could call it the industry or in public sector right now, is to what extent briefing notes matter anymore. I'm starting to hear disconcerting noises from within bureaucracies that briefing notes aren't really valued anymore because decision makers know what decision they want to make. They just want documentation to support it. So it really doesn't matter what's in the briefing note. They knew where they were going with their decision anyway. But leave that for aside for the moment. There's still this activity that happens quite frequently inside governments. And of these 5 policy archetypes, and this comes from previous research I've done over a couple decades ago now, there are 5 sort of activities that are happening inside the public sector, of which synthesizing a large volume of information and putting it into a briefing note is something that a lot of policy analysts see as a core aspect of their job. I'll move on to the way that this has started to change. This traditional approach has started to change, at least in my teaching. I have to say, this isn't universal amongst my colleagues. Some of my colleagues still want to, and I don't disparage this, but they want to shut the door on generative AI and tell students you need to learn from first principles how to write briefing notes. I've taken the view, given the fact that this is starting to influence the way that this kind of activity is happening in government in real time, that we need to learn, the students need to learn how this happens, how they can do it well, and what to watch out for in doing so. So we've started to introduce this into my teaching, and I'll show you exactly how that happens in a few minutes. But I just want to flag some of the benefits and pitfalls of this, some of the strengths and weaknesses. One of the strengths is that for students who have never done this before, their acceleration in terms of being able to write good briefing notes is beyond what I could ever do in previous years. So in previous years, after 13 weeks, I was still struggling with a lot of students to pull them through the process of how to actually write a briefing note. Now, within 2 to 3 weeks, they're at the point where they can produce, with the support of generative AI, they can produce a very good briefing note and center on more fundamental tasks than just looking at a blank page or a template and saying, I don't know where to start. Some of the weaknesses, though, generative AI writes very good briefing notes. I just don't dispute that. And this goes back even to GPT-3, some of our earlier experiments with this over 5 years ago now. But they're very generic, and I'll talk about how they're generic in a minute. Some of the opportunities, students or practicing policy analysts can use generative AI for option brainstorming. So I talked about 3 options that you have to identify. Well, sometimes I don't know what the options are, but I can use generative AI in an iterative way to sort of develop those options. I can work on the advantages and disadvantages, the pros and cons. Some of the other downsides, these briefing notes are very bland. They do not have, and I don't think that briefing notes necessarily have to have a personality, but policy analysts need to make a statement of some consequence and communicate that to the decision maker. How is this a challenging problem? What are the opportunities or some of the things to watch out for in moving forward? They are decontextualized. They're not contextualized in the particular jurisdiction, which is very important in briefing note writing. You cannot write a briefing note for a Minister of Environment in Saskatchewan that is written from the perspective of Minister of Health in Quebec. They are different briefing notes. They focus, even if the issue is the same, the focus and the direction is different. Path dependency, we sometimes set up the problem that we just stay on the same path we've been on before because of the way that LLMs and generative artificial intelligence works. And avoiding immersion in the material is something, as Dr. Yao was just saying, the ability to think, to put yourself in the position of having to think through the problem and how can we understand the problem so that we can move forward to a solution. is really important. And I'll just say on that last point that the quote there, when I did this work 20 years ago, a policy analyst said to me, my next briefing had better be better than the minister's last Google search. That, I think, can now be modified into saying, I better be better than the minister's last interaction with ChatGPT. So quickly on these three approaches, on the first one, I have students do this in handwriting in class, no computer technology, and they do it in the first class and the last class. And what I'm looking for is a general trajectory and development. How can I distinguish how a student moves from their performance in having never seen this before to the 13th class in which they're showing their work. And I did this along with the students. They had this template, the issue was given to them, and they had to come up with some material just from their own brains on what a work from anywhere policy might look like in the public sector. On the second activity, the traditional approach, we go back to first principles, no generative AI permitted. Now, I don't check this because I don't believe these tools are quite ready to actually make any conclusive findings with respect to whether generative AI has been used or not. I simply say don't use it. And they write a briefing note with some direction. There's the assignment, you can see it there. They write a briefing note using the traditional method, finding source material, synthesizing it, putting it into the different parts of the template and working through the material on their own. And this is an example that a student has permitted me to share with you how they went at this problem, how they filled in the template using this traditional approach. And you can see this is quite good. I think this is the reason they allowed me to show it to you is because it is quite good. And I would put this in the sort of 90 to 95% grade category in terms of a briefing note. Now, the second approach, or sorry, I should say the third, there's a rubric that goes along with this, and I'm looking for, do they target it to the proper audience? Is the content good? Is it brief? Basically, does it stick to 2 pages? Is the writing well done, the grammar and all that, and do they attribute it properly? And there's the rubric in detail. Now, let me get on to the augmented approach, which is the core of what I want to talk to you about today, is I asked them to use generative AI in this process. So in the first case, they would take essentially the assignment with some additional explanation and put this into the generative AI tool of their choice. This one uses a particular GPT, which is already formatted with the template. They could upload the template, they could copy and paste the template, what have you, but they're basically putting the instructions into the GPT or into the generative AI prompt window and saying, write me a 2-page briefing note. I asked them to share the chat with me so that I can go back and see how they interacted. And I asked them, did they iterate or not? And students are allowed to iterate as much as they want, but I'm finding most students are simply doing a one-shot output of a briefing note. And this is what a briefing note looks like, at least it was a couple of years ago from that interaction. And this is quite fine. I mean, this is, it's very generic, it's not contextualized, but it's not bad. The challenge for students comes in the next step. So the next step is to edit that. So they take that output, they put it into a Word document, they share that first one with me, and then they copy it to a second Word document and turn on track changes. And what I'm looking for here is a critical evaluation of that first output. Can you identify where it's not contextualized? Can you identify where it simply makes mistakes? Can you identify where the options aren't quite the right options? And can you improve it? That's this core activity in this. So give me a monkey and 2 bananas. Anybody can write a first draft using generative AI. This is the hard part. And this is the thing I want my students to work on and to improve upon. And this is where the critical evaluation comes into place. And then they give me a final draft. They essentially clean up all the track changes in a third version, send me that, and I look at what they say is their improved final version of their interaction with generative AI. And the rubric is quite different than the traditional version. It focuses mostly on the editing, though I have to, I think, put more emphasis on the editing in future iterations of this. I'm also trying to think about how we can put more emphasis on the prompting activity, because I'm finding students, as I said, most just want to do one-shot prompting. And I think there's something more interesting to be had in terms of thinking about, again, their future use in practice, how they can get better at prompting. Again, there's the detailed rubric. If you grab the slides, you can see that yourself. So just some reflections really quickly on the handwritten briefing notes. A lot of students, again, have no idea. I get very few, additions to that template from some students. They're just don't know what has hit them, and they get much better over time. But I do need a structured way to think about how do I evaluate particular student performance from the first class to the last class. And I think that's going to tell us a lot about their trajectory of their development. With respect to the traditional versus Gen AI approach, I have set up an experiment that I can't share with you today, but measuring this performance across these 4 assignments. So they do in this order. The first one is with generative AI, the second one is independent, the third one is with generative AI, and the fourth one is independent. And I'm trying to pull apart that within subjects alternating design and what's happening with their writing, because I'm just not interested in them being able to use generative AI to be able to create a plausible briefing note. I want to know what the long-term effect is on their skills and abilities as policy analysts and as briefing note writers. But here's where I think some of the problems that we need to think about. What skills do students using generative AI need to develop? So is it better prompting? Should we be emphasizing more about the ability to interact with generative AI as a collaborator, as a almost coworker, to think about how to get better outputs out of the generative AI tool? And secondly, to focus on critiquing Gen AI writing, to remove unimportant information, to contextualize it in the setting that we're talking about, and ultimately to say something that's important, not simply say generically, well, there's 3 options and we might do a bit of this and a bit of, no, say something of consequence that helps a decision maker if they're truly interested in solving that public policy problem. As Dr. Yao was saying, as Dr. Steele was alluding to, there's some things that we have to think about what do people need to learn for becoming policy analysts in future, or in their context, different career trajectories. But in my context of policy analyst, citizen and stakeholder engagement is still a really important thing. And I don't think we're ready to turn generative AI loose on doing citizen and stakeholder engagement. This comes down to real hard work of interacting with citizens and stakeholders in real environments to understand what people's perspectives and problems are, to get better at appreciating what we can actually do. How to work with others within the organization in addition to those outside of the organization. The asking unanticipated questions is a key one, because I don't think generative AI is particularly good at this, but it can be used in a brainstorming way to start to expand our horizons as to how we think about the things we haven't asked yet. Responding to unexpected questions, thinking about what the minister might ask, being able to put yourself in that position is a key criteria of being a good policy analyst and really providing useful decision support. And how to just deal with complexity and communicating uncertainty, because I think generative AI gives the illusion of having a sense of understanding the world and giving that sense of certainty, which is, fundamentally inaccurate when it comes to policy analysis. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, we just don't know. So, and lastly, I'm really curious about what the impact is on long-term policy analysis and the ability to write briefing notes. If we take the analogy to calculators, generative AI is fine if all you're trying to do is add up numbers. But there's something really fundamental about policy analysis and briefing note writing, which goes beyond simply synthesizing what exists and putting it into the right boxes. Thinking about the context of the decision maker, thinking about the particular problem, about the issues that stakeholders and citizens are facing, and how we can develop decision support to move decision makers into a position of being able to make a decision that's better than they would be able to make if they didn't have this support. Thank you for this opportunity again. Happy to take any questions if there are any. I should have, and I didn't realize I had this last slide. Let me just speak to this if I have a couple more minutes. Just to say, what is it we are teaching our students for, and what skills are best left, what do they leave our programs with in terms of going into their careers? So is it about critical thinking and deep immersion? So then we might want to move away from these tools and say, just immerse yourself in the hard work of reading difficult material. Is it about the tools, and therefore we should emphasize how to use generative AI tools moving towards something like prompt engineering? And lastly, assuming these tools are being used, and they are being used, this is my approach, is to say, if we understand how to use these tools effectively, but not lose our critical evaluation of the outputs that are coming out of the model. There, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Longo. Really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your experience.